It's no accident that Jackie Lewis wrote her chapter on joy toward the end of a book about how to be fierce lovers in the world. And it's also no accident that I saved joy for our last worship on fierce love. Doesn't it seem like a terrible time to be talking about joy? The Russian invasion of Ukraine is one huge reason it seems like a terrible time, but there are a lot of other reasons that it also seems like a terrible time. Things are not going to be easier financially anytime soon. Not one of us sitting here can comprehend a 2024 presidential election in which the last president, who's being investigated on a whole variety of different fronts, would be a candidate. The list goes on. Who would be foolish enough to talk about joy at a time like this? Oddly, we are in good company with the first disciples and the early church. The Apostle Paul spoke of feeling joy every time he even thought about the community at Philippi, and he wrote to them while sitting in a jail cell he wasn't sure he would ever be released from. In the book of Acts, we read stories about how much persecution the early followers of Jesus were experiencing, and yet they were also experiencing joy in being together and in worshiping and in transforming lives. Joy is no stranger to hard and terrible circumstances. Joy was never something to be pulled out when the sun is shining and all systems are go and there's no trouble on the horizon. Joy is not only something we experience, it's something we do. If we want to experience joy, sometimes we simply need to make it happen. Let's explore what that means. My friend, Reverend Dr. Alan Hilton, is the executive director and founder of a House United movement in which he tries to facilitate conversations between groups who think they're opposites. And in a devotional that he sent out this past week titled A Quest for Joy, he tells a story about how the therapeutic field changed in the 1990s and positive psychology was born. Quote, sometime in the 1990s, a psych professor from the University of Pennsylvania called Martin Seligman was with his daughter in the family garden. As he worked, she tried several times to get his attention in the ways that 5-year-old children do. Finally, though, he snapped back at her as cranky parents do. Then something happened that changed the history of psychology. His daughter boldly asked Dr. Seligman whether or not he remembered how she used to whine when she was 3 and 4. She told him that when she turned 5, she decided to stop. And if she was able to stop whining, then he was able to stop being a grouch. Gotta love this girl, right? Later, Seligman reflected on the obvious fact that his young child had not sought therapeutic help to identify the deep causes of her whining. Instead, she had simply decided to behave differently and figured out how. Then life got better for her and for the people around her. It was simple, end quote. Well, what we all know is that it isn't always as simple as that sounds to change behaviors. Anyone who has ever tried to break a habit or begin a new habit knows that it is rarely the case that you can do the behavior once and it sticks. In extremely rare cases, someone might quit drinking or smoking or doing drugs in a day, But what is also true for that person is that they have to keep choosing that behavior every single day and every single hour. A 5-year-old who decides to stop whining of their own volition is perhaps a unicorn. But apparently, this young child did just that. So my friend Alan goes on to reflect, quote, "So goes the legendary origin of the field we call positive psychology, and it has changed the therapeutic field drastically. As one author summarizes it, this method focused first on developing what was right rather than fixating on what was wrong. Oddly, for something so central to the human quest, the scientific study of happiness and joy began very recently. Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung dominated psychology throughout the 20th century, so most of the therapeutic focus landed on the patient's past, according to Freud, or on their dreams, according to Jung, to free the subject from entanglements and subconscious impediments, obstacles to thriving. Many, many people were and continue to be helped by these methods. But when Seligman and others began to consider the clearest paths to flourish, a new discipline broke out at Penn throughout the academic world and ultimately in a rapidly growing lot of therapeutic practices. Where Freudians and Jungians majored in extensive office couch analysis of unseen forces, positive psych moves subjects quickly into practices, for example, expressions of gratitude, that embed more positive and healthier habits of mind. Mindfulness regimens like meditation, envisioning, and whole body approaches to wellness have been multiplying as our culture has absorbed this affirmative way of pursuing joy, end quote. This affirmative way of pursuing joy. Don't you like how that sounds? Instead of waiting around for joy to drop from the heavens and fill us up, we have agency in how and when and where and why we experience joy. We all like the experience of being surprised by joy. There is no doubt about that. Animals that suddenly do something adorable or loving, children who delight us in the moment, weather that makes our skin tingle in the best of ways, visits from people we're close to who don't even care about how our apartment looks, cards sent in the mail by people who care, phone calls out of the blue asking how we are and really wanting to hear, putting on a coat and finding a $20 bill that we completely forgot about, something in nature that leaves us gaping in the best of ways. On the days when joy feels elusive and buried, rather than just wait for something to happen sometime in the future when we are feeling better, this affirmative way of pursuing joy is powerful. How do you pursue joy? I can list some of the things you do. Some of you take early morning walks. Some of you pay careful attention to what delights you each day. Some of you keep gratitude journals. Some of you host birthday bingo parties. Some of you talk to dear friends. Some of you are the sender of cards that others of us have received. Some of you make food for people who are hungry. Some of you pray and pray and pray some more. Some of you try new foods or restaurants or your old favorites. Some of you walk with people through life transitions and get to see new beginnings. Some of you volunteer your time to organizations that give your life purpose and meaning, including this church. Some of you play board games or do puzzles. Some of you write or sing or knit. Some of you even cook, as hard as that is for others of us to imagine. One of the things I do to pursue joy is photography. I hardly know what I'm doing, but I love being out in nature and looking for creatures and creation to photograph. I would have been a total disaster in the days of film and developing film, but with digital photography, I can mess up as much as I need to. I cannot explain why it gives me joy except to say that I think it is a form of art and creativity for me. And, like with my history with golf, every once in a blue moon, I take a shot that I think makes me look as good as the professionals. But that's not where my joy comes from. When I think more deeply about it, part of why I get such joy from photographing animals and trees and flowers and such is that I find myself in the picture. And then I end up feeling like I am part of the community. We're no longer separate beings or creatures, but parts of the same. Last summer, when Jeanette and I did a combination bike and kayak trip down the Fox River, I saw this blue heron and kayaked to the edge of the water lilies and sat very still in my kayak with my camera. This heron posed in an open stance for a little while and then posed in a closed stance, all while I was within about 30 feet. Most birds will fly away when they see you. But on this day, this heron and I had a conversation. We were in community together. The heron was a little bit funny and had a sense of humor. As someone who is not a fan at all of organized and institutional religion, I often get asked, and I often ask myself, why I am still a pastor after 31 years. It's a fair question. My answer today is that I am not here for the institution or the religion. I am here for the church community. There's no doubt in my mind or in my experience that communities who choose to be together are holy, H-O-L-Y, and holy, W-H-O-L-L-Y, imperfect, frustrating as you know what sometimes, and a sacred place within which to learn and be transformed. I want to be careful to say that not every church community are places or people within which learning and transformation happen. Some church communities are quite toxic and frankly need to be dispersed. Some church communities that are toxic can be transformed, and some not so much due to resistance. So much of my joy comes from this church community and the community I experience with other faith leaders in the city. I have never attended a single meeting at this church where there wasn't at least a little laughter and where there wasn't at least a little joy. And we have had some hard conversations over the years. And the joy is that we love each other more because we've had those conversations. Joy in community is not something to hoard or to hang on to with the doors tightly closed, or to act as though there is only so much to go around that it's scarce. Instead, joy in community is one of the best things we have to share with the world. We are all very different people, and if we can experience joy together, the sky's the limit. The point of it all, though, is not to keep it to ourselves, but to share it with everyone we meet and to continually grow the community in all ways. We have punchkis to eat after worship today. And yes, we did that in part to give you an immediate experience of joy after talking about joy. Sorry to those of you on the live stream. We wish we could send them to you through the camera. But we hope you got a treat for yourself to share after worship. But the real joy will come in sitting down together and drinking coffee or tea or maybe even nothing and having conversation together. And even beyond our time for refreshment after worship, how do we experience joy in community? If you've ever read the epistles, meaning the letters to the churches that are in the Christian scriptures, you might get some glimpses of joy. And you will also get a real sense of how communities can disagree and fight and disrespect each other and be selfish and get sidetracked and engage in lying and choose sides and try to be better than each other. And so many other crimes and misdemeanors. In the letter to the church at Philippi, the Apostle Paul and Timothy, one of Paul's co-workers, send greetings to the church, and then they address the conflicts. But it's the section of greeting that I wanted to focus on today, and especially this part where Paul says, "I thank my God every time I mention you in my prayers. I'm thankful for all of you every time I pray, and it's always a prayer full of joy. I'm glad because of the way you have been my partners in the ministry of the gospel from the first time you believed it until now. I'm sure about this. The one who started a good work in you will stay with you to complete the job by the day of Christ Jesus. I have good reason to think this way about all of you because I keep you in my heart. You are all my partners in God's grace, both during my time in prison and in the defense and support of the gospel. God is my witness that I feel affection for all of you with the compassion of Christ Jesus." What Paul is writing here comes from an intimate place of relationship, and he experienced it in community with these people who he says are his partners. He tells them he feels affection for them, he holds them in his heart, he's thankful for them every time he prays, and it's always a prayer of joy. And yes, this is the same Paul who was sitting in jail while writing this letter. He is full of joy just thinking about them. Imagine what they must have done and experienced together for Paul to have that kind of deep affection and care for them, and to feel joy every time he just thinks about them. Clearly, they must have had some really great worship together. And clearly, they must have really changed some lives together. You might think that was all they experienced together, but if you read the rest of the letter, you discover that this community had some issues in how it was living together. And isn't that just like joy? Joy can be complicated sometimes, and communities definitely complexify it. What if your experience of community, and maybe even this community in particular, is not like my experience or like Paul's experience? What if you are not learning or growing or sharing your gifts or experiencing joy of any kind here? If that's true for you, I encourage you to talk with me or someone else, especially someone that you might know, and be proactive in finding out if this is a place and a people within which you can experience those things. When I have conversations with people who are unhappy here, sometimes it's because someone is serving in the wrong ways. And there is no joy in sitting on a committee or a team where you're not enjoying the work at all. Sometimes it's because someone hasn't yet figured out how to be involved. Sometimes it's because someone feels overwhelmed by life and is not receiving the support they need. Sometimes it's because I am not the right preacher or pastor, or our music is not the right music, or the people are just not the right fit, and styles don't match up at all. And that's okay. When new people are visiting or begin attending, I often try to meet with them to find out who they are and what or who they are looking for or hoping for in a community. It's so important that there's a good match. And by that, I don't mean that we are necessarily like-minded or alike in many things. The best communities are the ones in which there are varieties of thoughts, beliefs, perspectives, people, cultures, experiences, and gifts. Diversity of all kinds makes for stronger communities if there is good communication, mutual respect, a desire to learn and grow and understand each other, and a sense of abundance. No church community is the best match for every person. While that is true, it is also true that we're not necessarily going to experience joy in every single thing we do or every single time we are at church. Joy is not meant to be a demand or a requirement as much as it is a natural part of life, and as was mentioned earlier, something we can pursue. Jackie Lewis described joy as a feeling of freedom, of bounce back, of contentment, of wonder, as a reservoir of goodness that makes you rock back and forth and hug yourself. It makes you smile for no reason, or your smile might prompt it in someone else. It's the thing that makes you throw your head back and laugh a full-throated laugh. It comes around the way, on the way, in all the interstitial places between now and not yet, tired and rested, broken and healing, hopeful and worried. Sometimes joy is an eruption, a surprise. Sometimes it's just peace way down deep in your belly. It makes your face shine with gladness and contentment. She wrote an entire chapter about joy because it is the water of life. When we commit to fiercely loving as we work to build the beloved community, we will need the refreshment and nourishment and life sustenance of joy. Movement building and movement work is some of the hardest we will ever do, and joy is part of what gives us strength to do it. What are the spiritual practices related to joy? Some of them are the simple acts of noticing, naming, experiencing, and sharing. Stepping out of the river for a time when we need to rest, and then stepping back in, when our senses have been reopened and are ready. That is also part of the spiritual practice of joy. We cannot change systems of white dominance and oppression on our own, so movements are naturally communities of people. And these communities of people experience joy together and, in fact, claim joy as a form of resistance. How will you pursue joy in every community you are a part of? Amen.